The October morning carried a chill that settled into the bones before a person even stepped outside the cold that rolls down from the Smoky Mountains in the second week of autumn, when the leaves have just begun to turn and the air smells of wood smoke and wet pavement. It was the kind of morning that made most people pull their jackets tighter and feel grateful for warm kitchens and hot coffee. For Wyatt Hargrove, it was just another morning he dreaded with every part of his 8-year-old body. He sat on the concrete steps outside the main entrance of Ridgeline Elementary School on the east side of Knoxville, his Star Wars backpack slumped against his left knee like it had given up too. His sneakers were the ones with the fraying laces his mother had promised to replace when she got paid next Friday. His jeans had a grass stain on the right knee from 3 days ago that no amount of washing had fully lifted. And his left eye, if you look carefully in the pale morning light, still carried the faint greenish shadow of a bruise that had gone from purple to yellow to this last ghost of a color that refused to disappear entirely no matter how many mornings passed. He was watching the street. Specifically, he was watching the tail end of his mother's battered Honda Civic as it disappeared around the corner of Oakwood Drive, swallowed by the morning traffic heading toward the highway. He watched until there was nothing left to watch, until the street was just a street again, lined with modest two-story houses and chain-link fences and the occasional dog barking at something only it could see. Then he turned his eyes forward toward the double-glass doors of the school entrance, and he sat very still. Inside those doors was a hallway. The hallway led to a row of lockers, and the lockers led to a classroom, and between here and there was the part of the morning Wyatt could not control, the part where Tanner Whitfield and his friends would be waiting. He did not go inside yet. He had learned over the course of 3 months to time his arrival carefully. Too early, and he was alone in the hallway. Too late, and Mrs. Patterson marked him tardy. There was a window maybe 4 minutes wide when enough other students had arrived that the hallway was crowded enough to offer some protection. He had mapped it out the way a smaller, weaker creature maps the movements of predators. Not because anyone had taught him to do this, because survival had taught him. Wyatt Hargrove was 8 years old, and he had already learned that the world did not automatically protect you. He had come to Ridgeline Elementary the previous spring, transferring in mid-year when his mother moved them from a rental on the west side of Knoxville after the landlord raised the rent by $300 overnight. The move had been disruptive in the quiet, grinding way that moves always are for children who have not yet developed the vocabulary for disruption. New school, new faces, new hallways that all looked the same until suddenly they didn't. He had been fine for a while. Not popular, but fine. Invisible in the way that small, quiet boys who read too much and talked too little tend to be invisible, not targeted, just overlooked. The trouble had started in July at the tail end of summer school. Wyatt had tested into an advanced reading program that met twice a week in the library, a small group of 6 kids working through novels 3 grade levels above their age. He had not asked to be in the program. His teacher had recommended him. He had not talked about it, but somehow Tanner Whitfield had found out, and that was enough. Tanner was 11 years old, big for his age, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He played football in the fall league, wore his hair in a careful fade, and moved through the school's social landscape, the way certain kids do, like gravity, bent slightly in his direction, like the hallways reorganized themselves to accommodate him. He was not unintelligent. He was something more complicated than that, a boy who had learned early that power was available and had decided to take it. The first incident had been small, a lunchbox disappearing from Wyatt's cubby. He had eaten the school's backup lunch that day, a pale rectangle of something that claimed to be pizza, and told himself it was an accident. The second incident had been less easy to explain away. His library book, the one he was reading for the advanced program, a copy of a novel about a boy who builds a raft and disappears into the wilderness, was found torn in half in the boy's bathroom trash can. He had stood there looking at it for a long time before picking up both halves and carrying them to the librarian, who had looked at him with an expression that mixed sympathy with the careful neutrality of someone who did not want to get involved. By September, the incidents had a name, even if Wyatt never used it out loud. name-calling in the hallway, shoves that were calibrated to look accidental elbow into the shoulder as Tanner passed hard enough to send Wyatt stumbling into the lockers, but soft enough that a passing teacher could reasonably believe it was two boys simply failing to navigate a crowded corridor. Lunch stolen openly, brazenly, the tray slid away across the cafeteria table while Tanner's two friends, a thick-necked boy Wyatt thought of simply as the one who laughs, and another who stood slightly apart watching with an expression of someone who knew better but had decided not to show it, watched and said nothing. And then, 3 weeks into September, it stopped being incidental. The playground behind Ridgeline Elementary was divided informally into territories the way school playgrounds always are. The blacktop near the basketball hoops belonged to the older kids. The wooden climbing structure near the fence was neutral ground. The gravel area near the back wall, shaded by two oak trees that the school had never gotten around to trimming, was where the smaller kids tended to drift during recess, out of the main currents of movement and noise. Wyatt had been sitting there with a paperback book when Tanner found him. The details of what happened next were not complicated. Tanner had grabbed the book, read the title aloud in a mocking voice, and when Wyatt stood up and reached for it, Tanner had shoved him. Not the calibrated, deniable shove of the hallways. A real one, both hands full weight behind it. Wyatt had gone down hard into the gravel, catching himself on his palms, knees scraping across the rough surface. The book had landed somewhere to the left. Tanner had said something Wyatt could not later remember the exact words, only the tone, the boredom in it, the absence of any particular cruelty, because cruelty implies effort, and this had not required any, and walked away. The recess monitor had been at the other end of the playground. Wyatt had picked himself up, retrieved the book, and gone inside when the bell rang. His palms had bled a little. His knees had bled more. He had cleaned them in the boys' bathroom with paper towels and cold water, the way he had learned to do these things without making a scene, and gone to class. That evening, when his mother had seen the scrapes and the beginning of the bruise forming around his left eye, he had caught Tanner's elbow going down a detail he had almost managed to convince himself was accidental. He had told her he fell on the playground. She had looked at him for a long moment. Diane Hargrove had worked 2 jobs for most of Wyatt's life and had developed out of necessity a fine-tuned instinct for when her son was not telling her the full truth. But she also knew that pushing too hard too fast could close a door that was hard to reopen. So she had cleaned the scrapes, carefully put antibiotic ointment on the deeper ones, and said, "Only if something is happening at school you can tell me." He had nodded and said nothing. 2 nights later, she had heard him crying in his room, not the loud, cathartic crying of a child who has skinned a knee, the quiet kind, the kind that meant he had been trying not to cry for a long time and had finally run out of the ability to hold it. She had stood outside his door with her hand on the doorknob for a long moment, listening to him say in a voice barely above a whisper, "I don't want to go. I don't want to go back." She had opened the door then. Diane Hargrove was 34 years old and looked on most mornings like someone who had been fighting a war that nobody had officially declared. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. She had grown up in a family that treated self-reliance as a religion and asking for assistance as something close to a moral failing, and she had carried that into her adult life with the grim determination of someone who has never questioned the weight they've decided to carry. She worked the morning shift at a diner on Kingston Pike and the evening shift 3 nights a week at a medical supply warehouse on the south side. On the nights she worked the warehouse, Wyatt stayed with a neighbor 2 doors down. Mrs. Fielding, a retired school teacher who fed him soup and let him watch nature documentaries until Diane came home. It was not the life Diane had imagined. It was the life she had built, and she was not ashamed of it. But it left her very little room for emergencies. The bruise on Wyatt's eye was an emergency. She had gone to the school the following Monday morning and asked to speak with Principal Garrett. She had brought photos on her phone pictures she had taken of Wyatt's scraped knees and the bruise developing around his eye, pictures that were clear and time-stamped and undeniable. Garrett was a man in his early 50s with the manner of someone who had spent decades in educational administration and had somewhere along the way developed a practiced smoothness, a way of listening that felt attentive but committed to nothing. He had looked at the photos. He had nodded at appropriate intervals. He had used words like concerning and will be looked into and rest assured. He had walked her to the door of his office with a handshake and an expression of sincere engagement that she would later realize had never once committed him to any specific action. Nothing changed. A week passed, then another. Wyatt came home with a torn shirt that he said snagged on a fence. He came home one Thursday afternoon and ate dinner without speaking, and when she asked him how his day was, he said fine, in the flat voice of someone describing a disaster they have given up expecting anyone to believe. She found a note in his backpack written in a handwriting that was not his. 3 words that she photographed before throwing away 3 words that made her hand shake slightly as she dialed the school's main number the following morning. The second meeting with Garrett was less smooth. She had come with a folder this time, printed copies of the photos, a written account of every incident. She had documented the note from the backpack. Garrett had looked through it with the expression of a man examining paperwork he had not been expecting. He had assured her again. He had used the phrase, boys will be boys, exactly once, and she had watched him register belatedly that this had been the wrong thing to say when her expression did not change, but her eyes went very still. He had walked it back. He had said bullying was taken very seriously at Ridgeline. He had scheduled, he told her, a conversation with the relevant students. The relevant students, as if Tanner Whitfield and his friends were a topic to be discussed rather than the source of documented injuries. She drove home from that second meeting with the cold clarity of a person who has begun to understand the shape of the problem. It was not that Garrett was lazy or indifferent, though perhaps he was both. It was something more structural, more deliberate. She could feel it without yet being able to name it, the way a pressure system feels before you can see the clouds that are forming. She went back a third time in early October, this time asking specifically what consequences had been imposed, what specific steps had been taken, what timeline she could expect for resolution. Garrett's smoothness had developed a new quality by this point, something that was almost but not quite impatience. He had told her the situation was being monitored. He had suggested gently but unmistakably that Wyatt might benefit from working on his social skills, on learning to navigate peer dynamics. She had looked at him across the desk for a long moment. She said, "My son has a bruise on his face and torn clothing, and a threatening note in his backpack, and you are suggesting that the problem is his social skills." Garrett had said nothing to that. He had looked down at his desk, then back up at her, and said he would be in touch. She had left the building and sat in her Honda in the parking lot for 10 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. That evening, she called her brother. Ray Hargrove was 31 years old and had the hands of a man who had worked with engines since he was 16, permanently stained at the knuckle lines, with grease that soap and time never fully removed, calloused, in the specific ways that wrenches and torque require. He was not a large man, but he was solid in the way that people who do physical work for a living tend to become solid, compact, and certain of the space they occupied. He had dropped out of community college after a semester and a half and apprenticed at an auto shop, then drifted to motorcycle work because it paid better and suited some restless part of him that needed to be surrounded by things that moved. For the last 4 years, he had worked at Smokehouse Custom Cycles on the western edge of Knoxville, a garage that occupied a converted warehouse space and served informally as a gathering point for the local chapter of the Hells Angels. Ray was not a member. He had never pursued membership, partly because the commitment it required was not one he was certain he wanted, and partly because the work arrangement suited him exactly as it was. He fixed their bikes. They paid him fairly. They drank coffee in his garage and told road stories, and sometimes helped him move furniture, or showed up when his truck broke down on the highway, and he considered several of them Ironside especially to be something close to friends. It was a relationship built on mutual respect and the kind of trust that accumulates slowly over years of small actions. When Diane called that October evening, her voice was doing the thing it did when she was holding herself together by force of will alone, very precise, very measured, each word placed carefully to prevent the others from collapsing. She told him everything. The bruises, the meetings, the note, Garrett's smoothness, and the way every door kept closing without explanation. She told him about sitting in the parking lot afterward, unable to drive. Ray listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long has this been going on?" She said, "3 months." He said, "You did everything right, Beck, all of it." She said, "And nothing happened." He said, "I know." Then he was quiet again. She heard in the background the distant sound of a socket wrench on metal, and then it stopped. He said, "I need you to hear something. Can you listen right now?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I've been watching this for a while. I didn't want to tell you because I wasn't sure how far it would go, but it's gone far enough. I have something. Evidence. More than you have. I've had it for a few weeks." She said, "What do you mean you've been watching?" He said, "I drove past the school a few times. Parked down the block. I didn't go in. I just watched. And I have it on camera, Beck. Clear footage. The kid and his friends. Outside near the back fence twice in 1 week. The kind of footage that can't be explained away." The line was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. I am now." She asked him what that meant. He was quiet for another moment, and she could hear him thinking the way she had heard him think their whole lives, that stillness he had when he was deciding something that mattered. He said, "I'm going to make a call." She started to ask who he was calling, but something in his voice told her the answer would not reassure her in the way she needed, and that she needed to let him handle this the way he had decided to handle it. She had spent 3 months handling it her way. 3 meetings, a folder full of photographs, a son who cried quietly behind a closed door and said he didn't want to go back. She said, "Okay." He said, "Trust me." She did. What Diane did not know in that moment was that there was a piece of the picture she had not yet seen. She had attributed Garrett's unresponsiveness to the usual institutional inertia, the bureaucratic tendency to minimize conflict, to protect the status quo, to treat parental complaints as problems to be managed rather than problems to be solved. She had been wrong about the cause, even if she had been right about the effect. Principal Garrett was not simply indifferent. He was compromised. Douglas Whitfield was 47 years old and had served on the Ridgeline Elementary School Board for 6 years. He was a partner at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm with offices in Knoxville and Nashville, a man who attended the right events and knew the right people, and had cultivated over the course of 2 decades in the city a web of relationships that functioned as both social currency and practical insurance. He was the kind of man who returned favors and expected the same in return, who understood that influence was most useful when it operated quietly in the background in phone calls made before meetings rather than in the meetings themselves. His son Tanner was the center of his life in the way that only children of men who have achieved most of their ambitions can be the final project, the one that still had everything to prove. Douglas had watched Tanner grow with the pride of a man who sees his own best qualities reflected and amplified, and had responded to his son's difficulties the way such men often do, by removing the difficulties, not by addressing them, by making them disappear. When Garrett had called Douglas 2 days after Diane's first meeting to report that a parent had filed a bullying complaint involving Tanner, Douglas had listened in the careful way he listened to all inconvenient news. Then he had made 2 calls of his own, one to the superintendent's office, not to Dr. Sandra Pruitt directly, but to a deputy administrator who owed Douglas a favor related to a construction contract the school district had awarded the previous spring. The second call to Garrett himself, short and to the point, handle this quietly. Garrett had handled it quietly. 3 meetings, 3 folders of evidence, 3 times a mother had walked into his office and laid down documentation that should have triggered mandatory reporting protocols, and 3 times Garrett had thanked her, assured her, and done nothing. Because Douglas Whitfield had told him to do nothing. And because Garrett, who had 2 years until retirement and a pension he could not afford to lose, had decided that the math of self-preservation added up to silence. Diane had not known this. She had felt the shape of it, that resistance that had no visible source, that quality of doors closing without anyone visibly closing them, but she had not been able to name it. She had assumed incompetence. She had been looking at corruption. What Garrett had not accounted for in all of his careful, quiet management of the situation was the evening of October 12th, when Diane stood outside his office door for a moment before knocking and heard through the thin institutional wall Garrett's voice on the phone. She had not heard everything. She had heard enough. She had heard Tanner's name. She had heard Douglas. She had heard Garrett say in the practiced tone of a man reporting to a superior, "I've kept it contained, but the mother is persistent." She had stood very still in the hallway, her hand still raised to knock for a long moment. Then she had turned around and walked back to her car and driven home and called Ray. And Ray had made his call. Frank Callahan had been known as Ironside for so long that there were men in the chapter who did not know his given name without thinking about it. He had earned the road name in his mid-20s after a motorcycle accident on a mountain highway in eastern Tennessee that should, by any reasonable medical assessment, have left him unable to walk. He had walked out of the hospital 6 weeks later and gotten back on a bike within the month, and the name had stuck, as names do when they contain a truth about a person. He was 52 years old, built like the kind of man who has never stopped doing physical work, with a gray-streaked beard that fell to mid-chest and forearms covered in tattoos that had accumulated over 30 years, like a record of everywhere he had been and everything he had survived. He had done 2 tours in Iraq with the Marine Corps before coming home to Tennessee and finding his way through a series of steps that made perfect sense in retrospect to the Brotherhood of the Road. He had buried a younger brother, drunk driver, midnight highway, no survivors, and the grief of that had settled somewhere deep in him and become over the years something else. Not healed, transformed. A source of the fierce protectiveness he felt about the vulnerable, the instinct to stand between the people who could not protect themselves and the forces that moved against them. He was in the garage at Smokehouse Custom Cycles working on a transmission rebuild when Ray called. He listened without speaking for the duration of Ray's explanation. The 8-year-old, the bruises, the mother who had done everything right and been stonewalled at every turn, the school board member pulling strings in the background, the footage Ray had. When Ray finished, Ironside set down the wrench he had been holding. He said, "How old is the kid?" Ray said 8. Ironside was quiet for a moment. He said, "Give me 24 hours. The calls he made that night went out to chapter presidents and road captains across Tennessee, into Kentucky and northern Georgia. The message was the same in every call: a child needed help. The adults responsible for protecting him had chosen not to. They were going to change that. Some of the men and women he called asked questions. Most did not. They had ridden with Ironside long enough to know that he did not waste a call on something that wasn't real. By midnight, confirmations were rolling back in. Brothers and sisters across 3 states were checking tire pressure fueling tanks, pulling on vests that carried the insignia of decades of brotherhood. In a house on the east side of Knoxville, Wyatt Hargrove lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow was Wednesday. He had already rehearsed. The 4-minute window had already mapped the route from the car to the classroom that minimized exposure. He was 8 years old, and he was planning his passage through a school hallway the way soldiers plan passage through hostile territory. And he had no way of knowing that in garages across 3 states, engines were being started for him. He turned onto his side and closed his eyes and tried not to think about the morning. Down the hall, Diane sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Ray's words still in her ear. "I'm going to make a call." She had asked him once years ago about the men at the garage, whether they were dangerous, whether she should be worried about Ray being around them. Ray had thought about it before answering, which was the thing she had always trusted about him. Then he had said, "They've got a code. You follow the code, you're protected. You hurt someone who can't protect themselves, you answer for it." She had thought about that answer many times over the years. She thought about it now, sitting in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, listening to the house settle around her. She did not sleep well, but somewhere in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion won, and 200 miles of Tennessee highway away headlights began to move. The morning of Wednesday, October 15th, arrived with the same mountain chill as every other morning that week, the sky pale gray at the edges and deepening to a cold blue overhead. Wyatt ate cereal at the kitchen table without tasting it, watching the clock the way he always did on school mornings, calculating. His mother stood at the counter with her back to him, and he could tell from the particular set of her shoulders, that careful stillness that meant she was holding something, that something was different about this morning without knowing what it was. She turned and looked at him. Her expression was the one she wore when she was trying to give him something without quite being able to say what it was. She said, "I need you to know that things are going to change. Okay, whatever happens today, things are going to change." He looked at her. He said, "Okay." She drove him to school in the Honda, the heater running the radio off. She pulled into the pickup line and sat for a moment after she stopped the car. She said, "I love you. You know that." He said, "I know." He climbed out of the car with his Star Wars backpack and walked toward the entrance of Ridgeline Elementary. She watched him go that walk she had been watching for 3 months, with her heart breaking a little more each time the shuffle of a boy who has learned to make himself small. She watched until he was inside. Then she sat in the parking line and waited because Ray had told her to wait, and she trusted him. At 7:23 in the morning, she heard it. It began as a vibration more than a sound. Something felt through the car's chassis before it registered as noise. A low rhythmic rumble that seemed to come from every direction at once, building in the way that approaching weather builds inexorable, with a quality that made the air feel different. Then the sound resolved itself, and she understood what she was hearing. Engines. Dozens of them. Then more. She turned in her seat and saw them coming down Oakwood Drive 2 by 2, a formation that stretched back farther than she could see, chrome catching the pale October light, leather vests carrying insignia that most people only ever encountered in news stories or movies. They moved with the unhurried certainty of people who have decided something and are in the process of enacting that decision. At the front, on a Road King that gleamed like it had been polished for this exact moment, rode a man with a gray-streaked beard, in the posture of someone who has never once in his life doubted his right to take up space. Diane's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the steering wheel. She said to no one in a voice barely above a whisper, "Oh, Ray." Inside Ridgeline Elementary, in Mrs. Patterson's third-grade classroom, Wyatt Hargrove was sitting at his desk with a math worksheet in front of him when the rumble started. He looked up. Other kids were already turning toward the windows. The sound was growing not just loud now, but physical, something that moved through the walls and the floor and the air in the room, something that could not be ignored or explained away. Mrs. Patterson started to say something about paying attention. Then she stopped, because she was looking out the window too. Wyatt got up from his desk and walked to the window. He stood on his toes to see over the sill. What he saw stopped every thought in his head. They were everywhere. The street, the parking lot, the curbs on both sides of Oakwood Drive, covered in motorcycles, and the people who rode them, a river of chrome and leather that seemed to have no beginning and no end. They were still arriving, still pulling in and filling every available space with a precision that suggested this had been planned, that each of these people knew exactly where they were going and why. They dismounted and stood beside their bikes with arms crossed, and the effect was of a wall being constructed in real time, not a wall of aggression, but of presence, of the simple, undeniable fact of a very large number of people who had decided to be here. Wyatt stared. He did not know what was happening. He did not know who these people were or why they had come. He only knew that the morning felt different, that something had shifted in the air outside, that the school he had been walking into every day for 3 months, with his shoulders hunched and his 4-minute window memorized, was in this moment surrounded by something he did not have words for yet. A knock came at the classroom door. Mrs. Voss, the school counselor, looked in. She was a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses. She was always losing and finding again, and she had the expression of someone trying carefully not to communicate alarm. She found Wyatt at the window and said in the careful voice of someone who has been thinking about how to say a thing for several minutes, "Wyatt, can you come with me, please?" His stomach dropped. He thought he was in trouble. He always thought he was in trouble because for 3 months the world had been teaching him that the default state was trouble, that calm was temporary, and the question was only when the next thing would happen and what it would be. He picked up his backpack and followed her into the hallway. They walked past classrooms where faces were pressed against glass. They walked past the cafeteria where the lunch staff had stopped working entirely to look outside. They walked the full length of the school's main corridor and through the double doors at the front entrance, and the cold October air hit Wyatt's face, and he stepped outside. And there they were. Hundreds of motorcycles. Hundreds of people standing quietly, some with arms crossed, and some leaning against their bikes, and some simply looking at him with expressions he had never had directed at him before. Not pity, not the complicated, embarrassed sympathy of adults who know something bad is happening and have decided not to intervene. Something else. Something that looked to an 8-year-old boy who had spent 3 months learning that the world did not automatically protect you remarkably like intention. A man walked toward him from the front of the formation. Large, broad-shouldered beard gray and full arms covered in ink, wearing a leather vest with insignia that Wyatt did not know but somehow understood represented something serious. The man moved without hurrying, with the quality of someone who has nowhere else to be and no doubt about where he is. He stopped in front of Wyatt and knelt down on one knee so that his eyes were level with Wyatt's. He said in a voice that was quieter than Wyatt had expected, "My name is Frank. But my friends call me Ironside. Your Uncle Ray is a friend of mine. He told me you've been having some trouble at school." Wyatt looked at him. He was not able to find words. Ironside said, "We heard about that, and we decided that wasn't okay." He said it simply, without drama, without the performance of emotion that adults sometimes deployed when they wanted children to believe they cared. He said it the way a person states a fact that requires no decoration. "Nobody gets to hurt you, Wyatt. Not here, not anywhere. You understand?" And something cracked open in Wyatt Hargrove's chest. Not painfully, not in the way the last 3 months had cracked things open, but in the way a window opens in a room that has been closed too long, and the air that comes in is cold and clean, and carries with it the sudden, overwhelming possibility that the world is larger than the part of it you have been living in. His eyes filled with tears. He had held everything for so long, the fear, the shame, the loneliness of a child who has been taught by experience that the people responsible for protecting him will not. And it came up now in one sudden wave that he could not hold back and did not try to. He said in a voice barely above a whisper, "They won't stop. I try to stay out of the way, but they won't stop." Ironside looked at him steadily. He said, "They will now." He placed one hand, large, calloused, certain, gently on Wyatt's shoulder. And for the first time in 3 months, Wyatt Hargrove did not feel like he was standing alone. Behind Ironside, the wall of bikers stood silent in the October morning light. A woman named Sable, who was a nurse and had ridden through the night from Nashville, wiped tears from her face without embarrassment. A man called Deacon, older than most of the others, stood apart from the group and looked away at the mountains in the distance. His jaw set, his eyes, carrying something that had nothing to do with this morning and everything to do with it. Principal Garrett had come out of the building by now, his face the color of paper, his tie slightly crooked in the way of a man who dressed in a hurry. He stood at the top of the steps and looked out at the assembled motorcycles and the assembled people and the small boy standing in front of the man who was kneeling in the middle of it all, and he understood with the sudden clarity of a man whose carefully maintained situation has just changed entirely, that whatever calls he had been making and whatever quiet management he had been conducting had just run out of room to operate. Ironside stood slowly and turned to look at him. He said, "Principal Garrett, we need to talk." Garrett opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. He said, "I'll need to make some calls." Ironside said, "You do that. We'll wait." And behind him, 500 engines had gone quiet, and the silence they left was louder than anything that morning had yet contained. The silence that followed the engines going quiet was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of held breath of a situation that had not yet resolved itself into something anyone could name. The motorcycles sat in neat rows along Oakwood Drive, and the school parking lot chrome cooling in the October air, and the men and women who had ridden them stood beside their machines with the patient stillness of people who had made a decision and were in no hurry to unmake it. A few parents who had been dropping off their children had simply stopped their cars in the middle of the street and were staring. Two teachers stood in the doorway behind Principal Garrett with expressions that mixed bewilderment with something that looked, if you watch carefully, like relief. Garrett made his calls from just inside the front entrance, visible through the glass doors, pacing the short distance his anxiety permitted. He had his phone pressed hard against his ear and his free hand working at the knot of his tie with the repetitive motion of a man who does not know what else to do with his hands. Wyatt watched him through the glass from where he stood near Ironside, and something occurred to him, the first clear thought he'd had since stepping outside, which was that Garrett looked afraid. In 3 months of meetings and reports and folders full of photographs, Wyatt had never once seen Principal Garrett look afraid. He had looked sympathetic and measured and professionally concerned. He had never looked like this. Mrs. Voss touched Wyatt's shoulder gently and said, "Maybe they should go back inside, find somewhere warm to wait." Ironside looked at Wyatt. He said, "You don't have to stay out here. This part is for the grown-ups. But I want you to know we're not going anywhere." Wyatt looked back at the assembled formation, the rows of motorcycles, the men and women standing quietly, and the cold people who had ridden through the night from places on the map. He couldn't name all of them here because Ray had made a call and Ironside had answered it. He looked back at Ironside. He said, "Will you still be here when school is over?" Ironside said, "Every single one of us." Wyatt nodded once. Then he turned and followed Mrs. Voss back through the glass doors, and the hallway swallowed him, and he walked to class. He sat down at his desk. The math worksheet was still where he had left it, the pencil resting across the top equation. Around him, his classmates were craning toward the windows in clusters of 2 and 3, whispering to each other with the electric energy of children who understand that something significant is happening but cannot fully decode it. Mrs. Patterson had given up on the fiction of a normal morning and was standing at the window herself, arms folded, watching the street below with an expression that had moved beyond surprise into something more contemplative. Wyatt picked up his pencil. He looked down at the math worksheet. He read the first problem and found for the first time in 3 months that the background noise in his head, the constant low-frequency calculation of threat and exposure, and the 4-minute window, and who was in the hallway and where Tanner was, had gone quiet. Not because the threat had been resolved, but because something had changed in the fundamental conditions of the morning, and his nervous system had registered the change before his mind had caught up to it. He solved the first problem, then the second. Outside, Ironside had turned back to Garrett, who had emerged from the building again, phone still in hand. Garrett said, "I've spoken with the district office. The superintendent has been notified." Ironside said, "Good." Garrett said, "I want to assure you that the concerns regarding the Hargrove boy are being taken seriously." Ironside looked at him without expression. He said they weren't being taken seriously when his mother brought you photographs of his bruises. They weren't being taken seriously when she filed 3 written complaints in 60 days. "What's changed this morning?" Principal Garrett opened his mouth and closed it again. Ironside said, "I'll tell you what's changed. We showed up. That's what changed. And I want you to think very carefully about what that means, that a mother did everything right, followed every procedure, provided every piece of evidence you could have asked for, and nothing happened until 500 people on motorcycles appeared in your parking lot. Think about what kind of institution that makes this school look like." He said it without raising his voice. That was the thing about Ironside, the thing that caught people off guard, that unsettled them more than volume or aggression, would have the absolute evenness of his delivery, the sense that he had thought about every word before he said it and had decided each one was exactly right. Garrett said nothing. Behind him, the school's resource officer, a young deputy named Briggs, who had been on the job less than 2 years, stood with his thumbs in his belt and the expression of a man rapidly reassessing his morning. He had stepped out when the formation arrived, hand moving toward his radio, then stopping when he counted the riders and did the math and understood that there was no version of the situation that ended well if it was treated as a confrontation. He had called his supervisor. His supervisor had told him to observe and not to escalate. He was observing. In the parking lot, Gravel had positioned himself near the school's side entrance, arms folded, watching. Crow stood at the far corner of the building, visible from the street. Sable and two other women had taken up positions near the main entrance walkway, forming a quiet, unmoving presence that parents dropping off children had to pass. Some of those parents had stopped to ask questions. Sable had answered them briefly, and clearly a child at this school had been repeatedly assaulted, and the school had failed to protect him. They were here to make sure that was understood. Some parents had gotten back in their cars. Others had stayed standing on the sidewalk, watching. Inside the fifth-grade classroom at the far end of the building's east wing, Tanner Whitfield sat in the back row with his face turned toward the window. He had been watching since the first engines appeared on Oakwood Drive. He had watched Wyatt be brought outside. He had watched the big man with the gray beard kneel down in front of Wyatt and put a hand on his shoulder. He had watched Wyatt stand straighter afterward. He had been watching for 45 minutes now, and something had happened in him during that time that he did not have the vocabulary or the self-awareness to fully name. He was 11 years old, and he had never in his life considered the possibility that Wyatt Hargrove might have someone in his corner. He had not thought about it in those terms, had not thought about it consciously at all. He had simply operated on the assumption that went unchallenged, which was that the power arrangement was fixed, that Wyatt was the kind of person things happened to, and Tanner was the kind of person things moved aside for. The assumption was no longer stable, and he could feel it. His friend Marcus, sitting to his left, said in a low voice, "What do you think they want?" Tanner said nothing. He kept watching the window. At 8:53 in the morning, a black sedan with county plates turned onto Oakwood Drive and slowed to navigate through the motorcycles that had spilled beyond the school's parking area onto the street. It stopped near the main entrance, and Douglas Whitfield stepped out. He was in a dark suit, tie perfectly knotted, the overall effect of a man who manages his appearance the way he manages everything, with deliberate control, presenting a surface that reveals nothing of what is operating beneath it. He was on his phone before he had fully closed the car door, speaking in the clipped, efficient manner of someone accustomed to solving problems by making the right call to the right person. He scanned the assembled formation with the assessing gaze of a man who has faced adversarial situations before and has learned to identify the critical variables quickly. He identified Ironside as the critical variable within 30 seconds. He crossed the parking lot without hurrying and stopped at a distance that was carefully calibrated, close enough for a conversation, far enough to avoid the impression of engagement. He looked at Ironside the way he looked at commercial tenants who were behind on rent, with a professional patience that carried an implicit message about who held the leverage. He said, "I'm Douglas Whitfield. I'm a member of this school's board of directors." Ironside said, "I know who you are." Something shifted fractionally in Douglas's expression. He said, "Then you understand that you're creating a disruption on school grounds that affects the education of several hundred children and constitutes potential interference with a public institution." "I've already spoken with the county sheriff's office. They're sending a unit." Ironside said, "Send 10 units. We're standing on a public street and a public sidewalk. We have not entered school grounds without permission. Nobody here has raised their voice or made a physical gesture toward anyone. We are within every right the law provides." Douglas said, "The noise alone." Ironside said, "Engines are off. Have been for 40 minutes. Point to the violation." Douglas was quiet for a moment. Behind him, Garrett stood very still, watching. Douglas said, "What is it you want?" Ironside said, "I want a child who attends this school to be able to walk through the front door in the morning without being afraid. I want the 3 written complaints his mother filed to have resulted in action rather than phone calls to school board members. I want the people responsible for the safety of every child in this building to do their jobs." Douglas said, "Accusations about my son." Ironside said, "We have footage. Your son and 2 other students assaulting an 8-year-old on school grounds, documented on 3 separate occasions over a period of 6 weeks. Your son's name is on those recordings. The footage has been provided to a journalist with the Knoxville Tribune, who is, as of this morning, aware of the full situation, including the board member who made calls to suppress a bullying complaint." The quality of the silence that followed this was different from the silence before it. It had weight. Douglas's expression did not change visibly, but something in the set of his jaw shifted. He had underestimated Ray Hargrove. He had known Ray as a mechanic, capable, useful peripheral. He had not considered the possibility that Ray had been patient and methodical and had spent weeks building a case. He had been managing a parent. He had not been managing an investigation. He said after a moment, "I'd like to speak with your attorney." Ironside said, "I don't have one here. What I have is about 340 people who are going to stay exactly where they are until the end of the school day, unless we see a concrete commitment from this school's administration to address what's been done to that child and ensure it doesn't happen again." Douglas said, "That's not how this works." Ironside said, "It is today." It was at this moment that a county sheriff's patrol car turned onto Oakwood Drive, navigating slowly through the parked motorcycles. It stopped and two deputies stepped out, taking in the scene with the careful measuring attention of officers who have arrived at a situation and are still assembling their understanding of it. The senior deputy, a man named Holt with 20 years on the job, walked toward the cluster of people at the school entrance and assessed. He had been briefed minimally large gathering, possible disturbance, school grounds. What he found was several hundred people standing quietly, no weapons visible, no aggression apparent, no violations he could immediately identify. Douglas walked toward him, phone still in hand, and began speaking in a low, rapid voice. Holt listened. Then he looked past Douglas at Ironside, who met his gaze with the patient directness of someone who has dealt with law enforcement many times and has learned exactly where the lines are and how to stand behind them precisely. Holt said to both of them, "I need everyone to remain calm. Is there a situation here that requires law enforcement intervention?" Douglas said, "These people are creating a disturbance." Holt said, "I'm asking about violations, specific violations." Douglas said, "They're intimidating students and staff." Holt looked at the formation, then back at Douglas. He said, "I see people standing beside motorcycles on a public street. I'm going to need something more specific than that." In Diane's Honda parked in the pickup line with the engine idling, she watched Douglas talking to the deputy and felt the knot in her chest pull tighter. Ray was beside her. He had gotten into the passenger seat 20 minutes earlier without asking, simply appearing at her window and climbing in, which was exactly what she had needed. She watched Douglas gesturing, watched the deputy's expression, and the familiar cold dread of 3 months of closed doors began to reassert itself. She said, "He's going to make them leave." Ray said, "He's going to try." She said, "What if it works? What if he has enough?" Ray said, "Watch Ironside." She looked. Ironside was standing exactly as he had been standing for the last hour, still unhurried, completely certain. He was talking to the deputy now, not loudly gesturing, minimally, simply presenting facts. She could not hear what he was saying. She watched his face instead, and what she saw there was not bravado or defiance. It was the settled calm of a man who has decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to his decision. She said, "He's not moving." Ray said, "No, he's not." The deputy conferred with his partner for a moment. Then he turned back to Douglas and said something that made Douglas's expression tighten. Then he walked back to his patrol car and stood beside it, not leaving, but also not advancing. Douglas stood alone near the school entrance for a moment. Then he turned and walked into the building. Inside, Wyatt had finished his math worksheet and had taken out a library book from his backpack, a new one, undamaged, a story about a boy and a horse in the American West. He was reading with the focused attention of someone who has found briefly a space where the noise of everything else cannot reach. Mrs. Patterson had settled the class into quiet, independent work, and the room had a hushed quality, the quiet of a morning that cannot quite commit to normalcy, but is trying its best. The classroom door opened. It was not Mrs. Voss this time. It was Vice Principal Marsh, a tall woman with reading glasses perched on her head, who generally ran the school's day-to-day operations with efficient invisibility. She came directly to Wyatt's desk and said quietly, "Wyatt, I need you to come with me again. There's someone who wants to speak with you outside." He looked up from his book. His stomach did its familiar drop. But then he thought about what Ironside had said, "We're not going anywhere." And he put his bookmark in and closed the book and stood up. Marsh walked him out through the side entrance rather than the front, which brought them out near the building's east wall where Crow was standing. Crow turned when he heard the door and nodded once the brief acknowledgement of someone who has been positioned here for a reason and is glad to see the reason materialize. They walked around the corner of the building to the front, and Wyatt stepped back into the October morning. The formation had not changed. If anything, it had grown. A few additional bikes had arrived in the last hour, finding spaces at the far end of the street. The men and women stood where they had been standing, some talking quietly among themselves, some drinking coffee from thermoses, some simply watching with the patient attention of people who have nowhere else to be. News vans had appeared at the end of the block. Wyatt could see the antenna masts, the side door logos of local television stations. Douglas Whitfield had come back outside. He was standing near the school entrance with a man in a dark suit. Wyatt did not recognize a lawyer, though Wyatt would not know that until later, and his expression had taken on a new quality, something harder and more deliberate. He was speaking with Deputy Holt again, and this time his voice was louder, carrying across the parking lot in the cold air. Douglas said, "I want them dispersed. That's a formal request from a member of this school's board of directors. These people are creating an unsafe environment." Holt said, "Sir, I've assessed the situation and I don't have grounds." Douglas said, "I'm telling you, they're intimidating my son's classmates. There are children inside that building who are frightened by this mob." Ironside said from 10 feet away, quietly, "Your son is frightened. The other children are watching from the windows and waving. There's a difference." Douglas turned to look at him. He said, "One more word out of you and I'll have you arrested for disorderly conduct." Ironside said nothing. He simply looked at Douglas with an expression of complete, unhurried patience. The standoff held for a moment that felt longer than it was. Holt stood between them with the expression of a man doing complex calculations. The assembled riders had gone very still, the quiet of people who have sensed a fulcrum point and are waiting to see which way it tips. Diane in the Honda had her hand on Ray's arm without realizing it. And then Wyatt Hargrove, standing beside Vice Principal Marsh at the edge of the scene, did something that no one had told him to do, that no adult had planned for or anticipated. He walked forward. He did not run. He did not call out. He simply walked across the 10 feet of parking lot pavement that separated him from where Ironside stood facing Douglas, and he came to a stop at Ironside's side and stood there. 8 years old, Star Wars backpack hanging off one shoulder, fraying laces on his sneakers, the fading ghost of a bruise around his left eye. He looked up at Douglas Whitfield. He did not say anything. There was nothing he needed to say. His presence was the statement, the small, specific, irrefutable fact of him standing next to the man who had come for him, looking at the man who had decided he was worth less than convenience. Douglas looked down at the boy. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not yet, but perhaps its precursor, the first contact of a thing that would develop fully only later in private in the mirror. 15 feet away, Claire Maddox raised her camera. She was 28 years old and had been covering Knoxville for the Tribune for 3 years, and she had a photographer's instinct for the moment. Before the moment, the fraction of a second when a situation crystallizes into its essential image. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier with a notepad and a camera, working the edges of the crowd for context and quotes, and she had positioned herself near the school entrance when she saw Wyatt walking out. The shutter clicked. In the photograph, which would run above the fold in the Tribune the following morning, which would be shared 40,000 times by noon and 200,000 times by the following weekend, which would appear on the websites of newspapers in 16 states, you could see everything you needed to know about the morning. The small boy, the man at his side, large and certain and still, the rows of motorcycles stretching behind them to the vanishing point, and Douglas Whitfield's face caught in the precise moment of contact with something he had successfully avoided for months. Claire's phone began to buzz 4 minutes after she posted the photograph to the Tribune's social media. Then it stopped buzzing individually and simply became continuous. Deputy Holt looked at his partner. His partner looked back at him. Some silent communication passed between them. Douglas made one more call. Whoever he called did not give him what he needed, because when he put the phone down, his expression had changed again, losing the deliberate control it had maintained all morning and becoming simply a man standing in a school parking lot who has run out of moves. He looked at the deputy. He said quietly, "I need a moment." He walked back into the building. Holt approached Ironside. He said in a conversational tone that was not without respect, "I'm going to ask you to keep things exactly as they are. No movement toward the building. No engagement with the students or staff beyond what's already occurred." Ironside said that's been our position since 7:30. Holt nodded. He went back to his car. Ironside looked down at Wyatt, who was still standing beside him. He said, "You didn't have to do that." Wyatt said, "I know." A pause. Wyatt said, "I wanted to." Ironside looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. He said, "Go back inside. It's cold out here and you've got school." Wyatt said, "Are you still going to be here?" Ironside said, "Until the last bell." "Every one of us." Wyatt looked out at the formation one more time. The rows of motorcycles, the men and women standing in the October cold without complaint, the wall of presence that had materialized from a phone call in the middle of the night. He looked at Gravel, who gave him a slow nod. He looked at Sable, who pressed her hand briefly to her heart. He looked at Deacon, standing apart from the others at the edge of the formation, who met his gaze with eyes that held something complicated and deep and did not look away. Then Wyatt Hargrove turned around and walked back into Ridgeline Elementary School. He walked with his head up. He had never walked that way before on a school morning. The photograph moved through the internet with the velocity of images that compress complicated things into a single undeniable frame. By 10 o'clock, it had been shared by a parenting blog with 300,000 followers. By 11, it had reached a national news aggregator. By 11:45, a producer at a cable news affiliate in Nashville had called Claire Maddox to ask if she was available for a phone interview. In the principal's office, Douglas Whitfield had made 4 calls and received from at least 2 of them news that he had not expected. The photograph had changed the mathematics. He had been managing a contained local suppressible problem involving a woman with no leverage and a child no one was paying attention to. The photograph had made the child someone everyone was paying attention to. The leverage had inverted. What had been a private arrangement between a board member and a principal was now a story with a face, and the face was an 8-year-old boy with a bruise around his eye, standing next to a wall of motorcycle riders in a school parking lot. Garrett sat across from Douglas and said nothing. He had run out of things to say. At 11:58, a car that was not a county vehicle and not a news van turned onto Oakwood Drive and parked at the near end of the motorcycle formation. A woman stepped out. She was in her late 50s, trim in a gray wool coat with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the manner of someone who has spent 30 years in rooms where decisions are made and has never once been intimidated by the decor. Dr. Sandra Pruitt, superintendent of the Knox County School District, had driven herself from the district office on Kingston Pike. She had not called ahead. She had seen the photograph at 9:52 and had spent the intervening hour reviewing Wyatt Hargrove's file, the incident reports Diane had filed, and the internal email chain that her deputy administrator had apparently not considered worth forwarding to her. She walked through the motorcycle formation toward the school entrance, and the riders moved aside for her with the unhurried respect of people who can tell the difference between authority exercised correctly and authority used as cover for something else. She stopped when she reached Ironside. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. She said, "You're Callahan." He said, "I am." She said, "I've read the file. All of it, including the parts that were supposed to stay in the district office." She said it without inflection, which made it more powerful than anger would have. Ironside recognized what he was looking at: a person who had discovered that something had been done in their name without their knowledge and had arrived at the scene in a state of cold, purposeful clarity. He said then, "You understand why we're here." She said, "I do." She said, "I'd like you to remain outside for now. I have some conversations to have inside." He said, "We're not going anywhere." She said, "Good." She walked into the building. She found Douglas in the principal's office and Garrett sitting beside him, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at both of them with the expression of a woman who has covered a great deal of ground this morning and is not in the mood for management. She said, "Douglas, we need to talk. My office. Not a suggestion. Douglas looked at her, then at Garrett, then back at her. He said, "Sandra, I can explain." She said, "You'll have the opportunity. In my office this afternoon. Both of you." She turned and walked back out. In the hallway, she passed Mrs. Voss, who had the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular kind of adult to show up and has finally seen one. Pruitt said, "Who is the boy's mother?" Mrs. Voss said, "Diane Hargrove. She's in the pickup line. She's been there all morning." Pruitt walked outside again down the steps past Ironside with a brief nod and across the parking lot to the line of cars. She knocked on the passenger window of the Honda. Diane rolled it down. Pruitt said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm Sandra Pruitt. I'm the superintendent of this district and I owe you an apology." Diane stared at her. Ray in the passenger seat said nothing. He was watching Pruitt's face. Diane said, "What kind of apology?" Pruitt said, "The kind that comes with action. Can you meet this afternoon, 4 o'clock? District office." Diane said, "I've had 3 meetings." Pruitt said, "Not with me. Not with what I know now." A silence. Diane said, "I'll be there." Pruitt nodded once. She turned and walked back toward the building past the long rows of motorcycles, past the riders who watched her go past Ironside, who was already talking quietly with Gravel and Crow. Inside the building in the third-grade classroom, Wyatt Hargrove was eating his lunch. He was sitting at his regular table, but something had shifted. 2 boys who normally sat at the far end had moved closer, and one of them had asked if they could see his Star Wars backpack, and Wyatt had said yes, and they were looking at it now with the exaggerated appreciation of children who are trying in the uncomplicated way of children to communicate something they don't have words for. Wyatt ate his sandwich and let them look. Across the cafeteria at the 5th-grade tables, Tanner Whitfield sat alone. His 2 regular companions had chosen independently and without discussion to sit elsewhere. He looked at his food without eating. He looked at the window. He looked at nothing in particular. The morning had taught him something, not the full lesson, not yet, that would take longer and require more than a single morning, but the beginning of something that had never occurred to him before. That arrangements he had taken as permanent were not. That the world could reconfigure itself overnight and leave him standing in a parking lot that no longer had the shape he remembered. He was 11 years old and he was beginning very slowly to understand something about consequence. Outside the formation held. Gravel had produced a thermos of coffee from somewhere and was sharing it with Crow and 2 other riders. Sable was talking with a parent who had parked her car and stayed a conversation that had started with questions and turned into something longer. Deacon stood at the edge of the formation where he had stood all morning, facing the Smoky Mountains in the middle distance, not talking to anyone. Ironside stood at the school's front walkway where he could see the entrance in the street in the parking lot where Diane's Honda was still parked. He had his arms folded and his face tipped slightly up toward the pale October sky, and he was thinking about a boy who had walked across a parking lot and stood beside him without being asked. 8 years old. At 2:45, the final bell rang and Ridgeline Elementary exhaled. Students poured through every exit, the organized chaos of 300 children released simultaneously into the cold afternoon. Parents in the pickup line pulled forward. The noise level doubled in 30 seconds. Wyatt came through the front entrance with his Star Wars backpack properly on both shoulders. He stopped on the top step and looked out at the formation still there, every single one of them exactly as promised. And something passed across his face that was not a smile exactly, but was related to one, the expression of a person who has been told something and has now had the telling confirmed. He found his mother's Honda and ran toward it. Diane had stepped out of the car when she saw him coming. She met him in the middle of the parking lot and pulled him against her and held on, and he held on back, his face pressed into her shoulder. She was crying. He was not quite. He had used up most of his tears that morning, but he was holding her very tightly. She said, "I see them, baby. I see all of them." Behind her from the formation, Ironside raised his hand. Engines began to start. Not all at once, not in a rush, but one by one, and then in clusters, the sound building back up from silence to the rolling thunder that had announced the morning. Riders mounted and settled and looked toward the front of the line. Ironside looked at Diane and nodded once. She nodded back. Then he turned to the formation and gave a signal, and slowly in the order they had arrived, the motorcycles began to roll. They came out of the parking lot and onto Oakwood Drive, and as Diane got Wyatt into the Honda and pulled out of the line, the formation fell in around her, not surrounding her but accompanying her, a loose escort of chrome and leather moving through the east side of Knoxville as the afternoon light came low through the trees. They rode with her for 6 blocks, through 2 turns, and a stop sign, the sound of the engines filling the street. Then one by one they began to peel off. Left turns and right turns, individual bikes splitting from the formation with a final wave or a lifted hand. Gravel peeled off, first heading north. Crow went east. Sable turned south at the 3rd intersection with 2 fingers raised in a salute. Deacon went last, holding until Oakwood ended at the main road, then turning west into the low sun without looking back. By the time Diane pulled onto their own street, she was alone. The sound of the engines had faded to nothing, swallowed by the ordinary noise of an ordinary Knoxville afternoon. But Wyatt was sitting in the back seat with his face turned toward the window, watching the space where the last motorcycle had been, and his expression was the expression of a child who has learned something he will not forget. He said quietly, almost to himself, they came. Diane said they did. He said all of them. She said all of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mom, I wasn't alone today. She gripped the steering wheel. She said in the voice of a woman holding herself together for the last time before she is allowed to fall apart, no, baby. You weren't. She pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the silence. Then the sound came again, distant, faint, rolling down from somewhere in the hills above the city, the last echo of 500 engines finding their way home. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it was gone. And the afternoon was quiet and ordinary and entirely different from every afternoon that had come before it. The district office on Kingston Pike was a 2-story building of beige brick that communicated institutional competence without warmth, the kind of architecture that says decisions are made here without suggesting that anyone particularly enjoys making them. At 3:55 that afternoon, Diane Hargrove pulled into the parking lot with Ray in the passenger seat and Wyatt in the back and sat for a moment looking at the entrance. Ray said, You ready? She said, I've been ready for 3 months. They went in. The conference room on the 2nd floor was already occupied when they arrived. Principal Garrett sat at the far end of the table with the diminished quality of a man who has spent a day watching his circumstances contract around him. The district's legal counsel, a woman named Harriet Boone, with silver hair and reading glasses on a lanyard, sat to his left with a yellow legal pad in the expression of someone who has already identified the liability and is managing it. Douglas Whitfield was there, his suit jacket on the chair behind him. Now his tie loosened in a way that would have seemed impossible at 8 that morning. And at the head of the table with a manila folder in front of her and the stillness of someone who has made all the decisions she intends to make and is now simply executing them sat Dr. Sandra Pruitt. Ironside came in behind Diane and Ray. He had changed nothing about his appearance. Same vest, same boots, same road-worn certainty, and his presence in the institutional room had the effect it always had, the way a large and unhurried thing causes smaller and more anxious things to recalibrate their sense of space. Gravel came in after him and stood near the door. That was all. 2 men, no performance, no demonstration, just presence. Wyatt sat in a chair against the wall near his mother out of the main circle of the table, his backpack on his lap. He looked at the faces around the table and said nothing. Pruitt looked at each person in the room in turn. Then she opened the folder. She said, I'm going to be precise and I'm going to be brief because the situation is not complicated, even though certain people in this room have worked hard to make it appear complicated. A child enrolled in this district was physically assaulted on school grounds on multiple documented occasions. His mother filed 3 formal complaints with supporting photographic evidence over a period of 60 days. Those complaints were received by Principal Garrett and not acted upon. The reason they were not acted upon is that Principal Garrett communicated their existence to a member of this board who used that relationship to ensure they went nowhere. I have the emails. I have the phone records. I am not here to discuss whether this happened. I am here to discuss what happens next." The room was quiet. Douglas said Sandra. "I think if we approach this constructively," Pruitt said Douglas. "I'm going to stop you there. What you did was not a gray area. You used a position of public trust to protect your son from the consequences of his behavior by suppressing a legitimate complaint from a parent whose child had documented injuries. That is not something we approach constructively. That is something we address directly and on the record." Douglas looked at the legal counsel. She was writing on her yellow pad and did not look up. Pruitt turned to Garrett. She said, "Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending a full review of your handling of the Hargrove complaints and any other complaints that may have been managed through similar channels. You will have an opportunity to respond to the findings of that review before any final determination is made." Garrett said nothing. He had the look of a man who had known this was coming since approximately 8 that morning and had spent the intervening hours getting used to it. Pruitt turned back to the table at large. She said, "Here is what is going to happen. Tanner Whitfield and the 2 students who participated in the incidents will be suspended for 2 weeks effective tomorrow. Upon their return, they will be permanently reassigned to a different classroom configuration that does not place them in proximity to Wyatt Hargrove. Each of them will complete a mandatory counseling program before returning to full student participation. Any further substantiated incident involving these students will result in expulsion proceedings." She said this district will implement a revised bullying response protocol within 30 days that includes mandatory reporting timelines, independent documentation requirements, and a direct escalation path to the superintendent's office that does not pass through a single administrator who can be pressured. A parent liaison position will be created to handle complaints independently of school-level administration. She said Mrs. Hargrove will receive a formal written apology from this district within 1 week. Not a form letter, a letter that acknowledges specifically what was done, what was not done, and what is being done in response. She closed the folder. She said, "Are there questions?" Douglas said, "My attorney will need to be involved in any." Pruitt said, "Your attorney is welcome to be involved in the portion of this that pertains to your board membership, which is a separate matter, and will be addressed through the appropriate channel. That process begins tomorrow. For tonight, what concerns me is the child." She looked at Douglas for a long moment. She said, "You have a son, Douglas." "So do I. I understand the instinct to protect them. What I cannot understand and what I will not excuse is protecting them by deciding that someone else's child matters less. That's not protection, that's instruction. And you've spent the last 3 months teaching your son what you believe about other people's children." Douglas was quiet. Something moved across his face, not the controlled management of earlier, but something rawer, less defended. He looked at the folder in front of Pruitt. He looked at his hands on the table. He did not speak. Pruitt turned to Diane. She said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I cannot undo the past 3 months. I can promise you that what I've described will happen on the timeline I've given, and that I will personally oversee its implementation. If anything falls short of that, you have my direct number, and you have Mr. Callahan's demonstrated willingness to remind this district what accountability looks like." She said it without irony, without resentment, with the straightforward acknowledgement of a woman who has looked at the morning's events and drawn the obvious conclusion. Diane said, "My son missed 60 days of feeling safe at school. He faked being sick to avoid coming in. He cried in his room at night. He learned to map out the 4 safest minutes of a school hallway like he was planning a route through enemy territory. He is 8 years old." Pruitt said, "I know." Diane said, "I need to know that what you're describing is real, not another meeting with nothing behind it." Pruitt said, "Come back in 30 days. I'll show you the implementation report. If anything on that list is not complete, I want to know about it before you leave the building." Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Ironside had said nothing throughout the meeting. He had sat with his arms folded and listened with the attention of a man who was tracking not just the words, but the commitments behind them, measuring the specific gravity of each promise against his experience of how promises tend to perform under the pressure of time and inconvenience. At the end, when Pruitt gathered her folder and signaled that the meeting was concluded, he stood and walked to where she was standing near the door. He said quietly, "You came down yourself." She said, "It was my district, my responsibility." He said, "A lot of people in your position would have sent someone else." She said, "A lot of people in your position would have let someone else handle it." He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "If this slips," she said, "I know how to reach you." He said, "Good." He extended his hand. She shook it. Then she walked out. Douglas Whitfield left the building alone ahead of the others without speaking to Garrett or to the legal counsel. He walked to his car in the parking lot and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. He watched Diane Hargrove come out of the building with Ray on one side and Wyatt on the other. Ironside a step behind them, and he watched the way the boy moved, not the contracted posture of someone who has learned to disappear, not the rounded shoulders of a child who has been taught that he takes up too much space. Something different, something that had not been there in the morning. There was no shuffle in him now. He moved like someone who had remembered something important about himself and was walking accordingly. Douglas started his car and drove home. He did not sleep well that night. The evening at the Hargrove house had a quality that Diane had not felt inside those walls for a long time. Not celebration exactly, because there was still too much that had been real, and too many months that could not simply be erased by a meeting, but something lighter than what had been there before. An easing of a pressure that had become so constant, she had almost forgotten it was pressure at all. Ironside arrived with Ray and 3 other riders at 7 o'clock carrying 4 pizza boxes and a 2-liter of soda, and the house that had been too quiet for too long was suddenly full of large men with road-worn faces sitting on the living room floor and eating pizza off paper plates. Gravel had brought a bag of beef jerky that he offered around with the proprietary pride of a man presenting a delicacy. Crow found the television remote and turned on a nature documentary about bears, which prompted a detailed and entirely unresolvable argument with Gravel about whether black bears or grizzlies were more dangerous that lasted 20 minutes and settled nothing. Wyatt sat on the floor with Ironside and spread his collection of superhero action figures across the carpet with the focused seriousness of a curator arranging an exhibition. The conversation that followed about the relative merits of different heroes was conducted with complete sincerity on both sides and covered in detail the specific tactical advantages of various abilities, the question of whether flight or super strength was the more useful gift, and the unresolved philosophical problem of what exactly determined who could lift Thor's hammer. At one point, Wyatt looked up from arranging a battle formation and said, "What about you?" Ironside said. "What about me?" Wyatt said. "If you had a superpower, what would it be?" Ironside thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about most things, all the way through without rushing toward an answer. He said, "The ability to be in 2 places at once, so I could be wherever someone needed me." Wyatt considered this. He said, "That's not very fun." Ironside said, "No, but it would be useful." Wyatt said, "I'd pick flying." Ironside said, "Good choice." Diane watched them from the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in her hands, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there since July. Ray appeared beside her and handed her a glass of water and stood with her for a moment not speaking, watching Wyatt arrange his figures with the unself-conscious focus of a child who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Ray said, "Look at him." She said, "I know." Ray said, "That's the kid he's supposed to be." She said nothing. She pressed her lips together and nodded. Later, when the pizza boxes were empty and Crow had fallen asleep on the couch during the bear documentary, Ironside found Diane in the kitchen and set his paper plate in the trash and leaned against the counter. He said, "Anything else comes up, you call Ray. Ray calls me. Day or night. We meant what we said this morning." She said, "I know you did." He reached into his vest pocket and put a card on the counter. It had a phone number and nothing else. She said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." He said, "You don't owe us thanks. Your brother called. We showed up. That's the whole story." She said, "It's not a small thing." He said, "No, but it's a simple one. Simple things get complicated when people stop doing them. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your son is going to be all right. I want you to know that. Not just because of today, because of him. The way he walked across that parking lot this morning. Nobody told him to do that." She said, "I know." He said, "That's not something you teach a kid. That's something that's in them. You spend 8 years raising someone with enough of something that they walk toward the hard thing instead of away from it when it matters. That's yours. That's what you built." She looked at him. She said he had good people today. He said he had good people today because he had a mother who didn't quit. Those are connected. He pushed off the counter and went back to the living room to wake up Crow. They left at 9:30, the engines starting up one by one in the quiet street, the sound briefly enormous and then fading as they turned at the end of the block and headed in their separate directions. Wyatt stood at the front window and watched until the last light disappeared. Then he went to bed and slept without waking once the first full night's sleep he had managed in 3 months. In the days that followed, Ridgeline Elementary underwent the visible changes of an institution that has been reminded what it is for. An interim administrator was appointed while Garrett's review proceeded. The counseling referrals for the 3 suspended students were processed within 48 hours. A notice went home to every parent in the district outlining the new reporting protocols and the direct escalation line to the superintendent's office. The school's hallways, which Wyatt had navigated for months with the careful wariness of someone crossing a minefield, became ordinary hallways again. Imperfect, occasionally loud, full of the usual friction of children learning to coexist, but ordinary. He walked them with his head up, not without difficulty. There were days when the old fear flickered at the edges of things, when a loud noise in the hallway or a certain quality of laughter made his shoulders rise reflexively. Healing was not linear, and he was 8 years old, and 3 months of sustained threat does not evaporate in a week. But Mrs. Voss checked in with him daily briefly and without making a production of it, and Mrs. Patterson had rearranged the classroom seating. Wyatt found himself sitting next to Marcus and Pete, the 2 boys, who had moved closer at lunch on the day everything changed, and what had begun as proximity became over the following weeks something cautiously resembling friendship. They ate lunch together. They argued about superheroes. Pete lent Wyatt a book about the history of motorcycles that his grandfather had given him, and Wyatt read it twice. Tanner Whitfield returned from his suspension on a Wednesday morning, quieter than he had left, and the 2 boys who had been his regular companions had redistributed themselves in ways that suggested the social arrangement had been reevaluated in his absence. He passed Wyatt once in the hallway in the first week back and stopped, and Wyatt stopped, and they looked at each other for a moment. Then Tanner turned and went the other direction. It was not resolution, it was not forgiveness, but it was the absence of threat, and for now that was enough. The story of what had happened on October 15th moved through Knoxville the way significant local stories do, expanding outward in rings, gaining detail in some tellings, and losing it in others, accumulating meaning that went beyond the specific facts. Claire Maddox's photograph ran above the fold in the Tribune and was picked up by wire services that carried it to papers in Nashville, Atlanta, and Chicago. A producer from a national morning show called the Tribune on the 3rd day. Claire's longer piece, which ran the following Sunday, and included Ironside's quiet words to her, "At the edge of the crowd, adults failed that boy. We just showed up," was shared widely enough that she received emails from across the country. Many of them from parents who recognized the shape of the story from the inside, who had sat in the same office chairs and heard the same smoothly managed reassurances, and understood exactly what it felt like when a door that should be open is held shut by invisible hands. 2 months passed. November moved into December. The mountains around Knoxville went bare, and then the cold settled in properly, the kind that meant it at night. Wyatt got a nearly perfect score on a reading comprehension test and brought it home and put it on the refrigerator himself, which was something he had not done since the previous spring. Diane took on 1 fewer warehouse shift and used the time to attend a meeting of a parents' advocacy group that a woman named Gail, whose daughter attended a school on the west side, had been running out of her living room for 2 years. The group had been doing careful patient work with limited reach. Diane's presence changed the reach because she had a name now, a story, and more importantly, a phone number on a card that she was willing to pass along. The advocacy group began to grow. Then January arrived, and with it the thing Diane had not expected. It was a Tuesday late afternoon, the sky already going dark at 5 o'clock. She had just gotten home from the diner and was still in her uniform when a knock came at the door. She opened it and found Douglas Whitfield on her front step. He was in a coat she had not seen before, dark wool hands in the pockets. He looked different from the man who had stood in the school parking lot in October with a lawyer and a phone, and the confidence of someone accustomed to having situations resolve in his favor. He looked smaller in the way that people look smaller when something has been removed from them that they were not aware they were using to take up space. She said, "Mr. Whitfield." He said, "I know I don't have a right to be here. I'm not here to ask for anything. I needed to say something in person, without anyone else present." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door. He came in and stood in the front hall. He did not sit down. He did not take his hands from his pockets. He said, "I resigned from the board in November. You probably know that. Tanner started seeing a therapist in October, the week after everything happened. He's been going twice a week since then." She said nothing. He said he asked me something about 3 weeks in. He asked me if I had made them stop helping that kid at school. That was how he put it. I had made them stop helping that kid. And he looked at me when he said it in a way I hadn't seen before. His voice changed slightly on the last sentence, not breaking but acquiring a quality it had not had before. He said I didn't answer him. I didn't know how. And I drove home that night thinking about the answer, and I realized that whatever answer I gave him was going to teach him something permanent about what I believed about other people, about whether they counted or not. He stopped. He said I was trying to protect him. I convinced myself that was what I was doing, that it was a normal thing to do, that any father would have done the same. But I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting myself from the inconvenience of having a son who had done something wrong. And in doing that, I was teaching him that wrong things are survivable if you have enough leverage. That was the lesson. I didn't mean it to be, but it was. He looked at her. He said, "What was done to your son and what was done to you, the way your complaints were buried, the way you were managed and placated and ignored, that was my doing. Not Garrett's, mine. I need you to know that I know that." Diane stood very still in her own front hall and looked at the man who had for 60 days decided that her son's safety was less important than his son's convenience. And she felt several things simultaneously that did not resolve into anything simple. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because I needed to say it to your face, not through a lawyer, not in a formal process. I needed to look at you and say it out loud." She said, "And does it change anything?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "For you, probably not. For Tanner, I hope so. For me, I don't know yet. Maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just that it's true, and it needed to be said to the right person." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "I'm not going to tell you it's okay, because it wasn't okay, and saying it was would be a lie, and I'm not going to lie to you." He said, "I know." She said, "But teach him now. Whatever you do next, teach him now, before it's too late to change what he knows." He nodded. He said, "I'm trying to." He turned and went back out into the January cold, and Diane closed the door and stood in the hall for a moment with her back against it. Then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the counter watching it heat. When Wyatt came downstairs in his socks 10 minutes later and asked who had been at the door, she said someone who needed to say something. He said, "What did they say?" She said that they were sorry. He considered this with the gravity that children apply to adult things they almost understand. He said, "Do you believe them?" She said, "I think they meant it." He said, "Is that the same thing?" She thought about it. She said, "Not always. But it's a start." He seemed to find this satisfactory. He got a glass of water and went back upstairs, and she heard his door close and then the sound of him reading aloud to himself, which was a habit he had had since he was 5, and which he seemed entirely unaware of, in which she had never corrected because it was the sound of her son being exactly himself, and she would not have traded it for anything. March came with the slow, provisional warmth that Tennessee delivers in installments each warm day, a negotiation with the cold that hasn't quite finished. The mountains softened from their bare winter definition into the first uncertain green of early spring, and Wyatt Hargrove turned 9 years old. Diane had asked him what he wanted for his birthday. He had said without hesitation the guys. She had laughed. Then she had called Ray. Smokehouse Custom Cycles had never hosted a birthday party before, and it turned out to be very good at it. The garage's main floor was large enough for tables, and by noon on the Saturday of Wyatt's birthday, those tables were covered with mismatched tablecloths and paper plates and 3 different sheet cakes, because Gravel, Crow, and Sable had each brought one independently without coordinating, which was entirely consistent with what Diane had come to understand about how the club operated. Each cake was different chocolate yellow with white frosting, and one that was inexplicably red velvet. And when Gravel and Crow realized the situation, they had a brief argument about whose was better that ended without resolution, which was also consistent. Wyatt's school friends came Marcus and Pete and 4 other kids from his class, and 2 from the after-school reading group, and they moved through the garage with the wide-eyed delight of children in the presence of machinery they are being actively encouraged to touch and examine. The riders showed them things, how a carburetor worked in principle, what a torque wrench was for why the chain had to sit at exactly the right tension, and what happened when it didn't. They answered every question with patience and specificity, treating each 8 and 9-year-old as someone whose curiosity deserved a real answer, which to Wyatt's friends seemed remarkable, because they were accustomed to adults who either deflected questions or answered them with the compressed impatience of people who had other things to do. Wyatt moved through it all with the ease of a boy on familiar ground. He knew where the tools lived and what they were called. He knew which bikes belonged to whom and something about the history of each. He showed his friends the inside of a fuel tank with the proprietary confidence of someone who has been coming here every Saturday for months and has accumulated genuine knowledge. And when Pete asked how an engine actually worked, Wyatt explained it not perfectly, not with the precision of an engineer, but with the enthusiastic, approximate accuracy of a boy who has been paying attention to the people who know and who loves the subject enough to have retained what he's been taught. Deacon sat in a folding chair near the garage's side wall, a paper plate balanced on his knee, watching. He had come as he always did without much announcement, arriving early and finding a spot at the edge of things and staying there. He was a man who occupied peripheral space by habit and long practice present, but not intrusive, watching the center of things from a considered distance. He watched Wyatt show his friends the motorcycle handbook Ray had given him dog-eared at a dozen pages, and something in Deacon's expression had the quality of a person watching a thing that matters and understanding precisely why it matters. Sable came and sat beside him. She set her plate on her knee and looked at the party for a moment without speaking. She said, "You doing okay?" Deacon said, "Yeah." She said, "You sure?" He said, "Days like this help." She said, "I know." They were quiet together for a moment, comfortable in the way that people who have ridden long distances together learn to be comfortable in silence. He said, "My boy would have been 31 this year." She said, "I know." He said, "I keep thinking, what if someone had shown up? That's all I keep thinking. What if one person had shown up and said, 'You're not alone'? Just that. Just those words." She looked at Wyatt across the garage. She said someone came for him today. Deacon followed her gaze. He said, "Yeah, someone came." He said it quietly and looked down at his plate and was quiet for a while. Ironside found Wyatt after the cakes had been cut and distributed, and the school friends were occupied with a complicated disagreement about something that seemed to involve both a motorcycle tire and the question of whether Superman could actually lift a building without it falling apart. And he led him to the back of the garage where Ray's truck was parked, and they sat on the hood in the thin March sunlight coming through the high windows. Ironside reached behind him and picked up something that had been sitting wrapped in a cloth on the truck bed. He handed it to Wyatt. It was a leather vest, small, made to fit a 9-year-old, with the same cut and construction as the ones the riders wore in the same worn black leather with the same silver hardware at the zipper and the collar. On the back, in careful embroidery that someone had taken their time with, were two words: Little Brother. Wyatt held it with both hands and looked at it for a long time. He said, "Is this mine?" Ironside said, "It's yours." Wyatt put it on over his sweatshirt. It fit well. Someone had measured carefully or known how to estimate. He looked down at himself, then twisted to try to see the back, which didn't work the way he wanted it to, and Ironside reached over and held up his phone so Wyatt could see the camera image. Wyatt looked at the reflection of the words on his back for a moment. He said quietly, "Little brother." Ironside said, "You're one of us now, in the ways that matter." Wyatt sat with that for a moment, holding the weight of it with the seriousness of a child who understands that some things are not small, that certain moments deserve to be met with full attention rather than passed through carelessly. He said, "Are you a hero?" Ironside said, "No." He said it without hesitation, without performance, simply as a statement of accurate fact. He said, "I'm just a guy who showed up." Wyatt said, "That's kind of the same thing, though, isn't it?" Ironside thought about it. The March light came through the high windows and lay across the concrete floor in long, pale rectangles. And from the front of the garage came the sounds of the party voices. Laughter, the occasional metallic clang of something being picked up and examined and set down again. He said, maybe sometimes they're the same thing. He said, "What I know is that the world has enough people who stand back and watch. What it needs is more people who show up when it counts." That's not heroism. That's just deciding to be useful when something matters. Wyatt looked at him. He said, "I want to be useful." Ironside said, "I know you do, and you will be. But right now you're 9 years old and there are 3 birthday cakes up front that need attending to." Wyatt said Gravel and Crow both got mad about the cakes. Ironside said, "I know. I heard. What I know about those two and food could fill a book." Wyatt grinned wide and uncomplicated and entirely 9 years old, the grin of a child who is in this moment completely and exactly where he is supposed to be, surrounded by people who mean what they say. He said, "Race you back." Ironside said, "You're on." He climbed off the hood slowly with great theatrical effort, groaning slightly as though the exertion were considerable, and Wyatt hit the ground and ran his boots, slapping the concrete floor, laughter rising up into the garage's high ceiling and finding nowhere particular to go and filling the space anyway. Ironside came after him at a jog, calling out that he was taking it easy on him out of pure generosity, which Wyatt did not believe, and Ironside did not expect him to. Diane watched them come around the corner of the workbench from where she stood near the utility sink. Her son in a black leather vest with 2 words on the back, running with his whole body, the way children run when they are not afraid of anything, when the only thing in front of them is the next few seconds, and those seconds are good. Ray put his arm around her shoulders. He said, "There he is." She said, "There he is." She did not need to say anything else. There was nothing else to say. Everything that needed saying was already in the room, in the sound of her son's laughter, and the smell of motor oil and birthday cake, and the afternoon light coming through windows that had seen decades of work and rest and road stories, and the particular kind of loyalty that does not require explanation because it has already been proven. The party wound down the way good things do, slowly and without anyone wanting to be the first to call it. The school friends were collected by their parents, each of them leaving with a story to tell about the torque wrench, about the fuel tank, about the man called Gravel, who knew more about engines than anyone they had ever met and had strong opinions about beef jerky. The cakes were reduced to crumbs and smears of frosting on paper plates. Someone found a broom and someone else found the dustpan, and the argument about whether the red velvet had been better than the chocolate resumed briefly and ended inconclusively. As the riders began the slow process of departure, Wyatt went to each of them. He shook hands where shaking hands was appropriate and accepted a side hug from Sable and a firm, brief clap on the shoulder from Gravel, and a nod from Crow that carried in it everything a nod from Crow could be expected to carry, which was more than most people's sentences. He stopped in front of Deacon last. Deacon was standing near the side door, coat on, ready to go. He looked down at Wyatt with the expression he always had, complicated, held carefully, not unkind. Wyatt said, "Thanks for coming." Deacon said, "Wouldn't miss it." A pause settled between them, comfortable rather than awkward. The kind of pause that means something is being considered rather than avoided. Wyatt said, "You always stand kind of away from everyone." Deacon said, "Yeah, habit." Wyatt said, "You can stand with us, if you want. Next time." Deacon looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in the set of his face, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible from across the room, just a slight change of a thing that has been held at a particular angle for a long time, being allowed very carefully to rest. He said, "I know, son. Thank you." He put his hand briefly on top of Wyatt's head, not ruffling his hair, just resting it there for a moment, the gesture of a man acknowledging something he does not have words sufficient for and is not going to pretend otherwise. Then he went out. The engines started one by one, as they always did, the sound building, from the first single engine to the overlapping chorus that Wyatt had come to know, the way you come to know the sounds of your own house intimately, without having to think about it, each one distinguishable within the whole. He stood in the open garage door and watched them go, the formation moving out of the lot and onto the road, chrome catching the last of the afternoon light at an angle that made everything look deliberate and clean. Ironside went last. He rolled to the end of the lot and paused there and turned back, and Wyatt raised his hand. Ironside raised 2 fingers from the handlebar, the brief specific salute that meant something inside the world these people inhabited, and that Wyatt understood now, not because anyone had explained it, but because some things communicate themselves through repetition and trust. And then he was gone, the Road King carrying him around the curve at the end of the block and out of sight. And the sound of the engine was already beginning to change pitch with distance, already becoming something remembered rather than something present. Wyatt stood in the garage door until there was nothing left to hear. Then he looked down at the vest he was still wearing, the soft, worn leather settling against his shoulders. The words on the back that he couldn't see but knew the shape of had traced them with his fingers when Ironside wasn't looking, the way you trace something you want to keep. Little brother. He stood there for a little while and thought about October. He thought about the 4-minute window in the mapped hallways, in the mornings he had sat on the concrete steps outside Ridgeline Elementary, watching his mother's car disappear and feeling the day ahead of him like something to be survived. He thought about the night he had pressed his face into his pillow and said, "I don't want to go back," and believed in the way that children believe things that have been proven to them repeatedly that nothing would change. He thought about the morning the engines came down Oakwood Drive and what it had felt like to stand at the classroom window and see what was there and understand before he had the words for it that the world had just gotten larger than the part he had been allowed to live in. He thought about walking across the parking lot to stand next to Ironside, not because anyone had told him to, but because something in him had known that standing still was no longer what the moment required, that there are times when the only right thing to do is to move toward the hard thing and trust that your legs will hold. He thought about what Ironside had said, sitting on the truck hood in the thin March light, "The world has enough people who stand back and watch. What it needs is more people who show up." He was 9 years old, standing in a garage doorway in West Knoxville in a leather vest with 2 words on the back, and he could not yet see the full shape of what the last 5 months had given him, or all the ways it would grow in him over the years ahead. He could not know that the instinct that had walked him across a parking lot would become over time something he could rely on, something that would guide him toward other people who were standing in their own versions of that gravel lot, outnumbered and afraid and uncertain whether anyone was coming. He could not know any of that yet. What he knew was simpler and more complete than anything he could have been taught. He had been alone and people had come. And that fact, the plain, undeniable fact of it, had changed the size of the world he believed himself to be living in. And he would not forget it. And when the time came, he would try to give it to someone else. He reached up with both hands and touched the collar of the vest. Then he turned back into the garage where his mother was rinsing paper plates, and Ray was in the middle of a story about the time Gravel refused to ask for directions for 11 miles on a Kentucky highway, and ended up on a gravel logging road that very much did not go where he needed to go. And the last of the red velvet cake was sitting on the table with one generous slice remaining unclaimed patient. Wyatt went and cut it and carried it to his mother where she stood at the sink. She looked at the plate, then at him. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged. He said, "I wanted to." She looked at him, her son 9 years old in a leather vest, 2 sizes too large, with 2 words on the back, holding a fork and a paper plate, with the complete assurance of a person who knows exactly where he stands. She took the plate. Outside, the Tennessee dusk was doing what it always does, settling across the mountains in long gradients of gold and rose, and the particular deep blue that comes just before dark, making everything look worth remembering, making the ordinary things glow briefly at their edges before the light goes. The road in front of Smokehouse Custom Cycles was quiet now, just a road again, the engines long gone and the street returned to itself. But if you had been standing there at that moment in the right quality of stillness, you might have felt it, not heard it exactly, but registered it in some part of you that is older than hearing. The resonance of what had moved through here. The frequency left behind by 500 people who had decided on a Wednesday morning in October that a child they had never met was worth riding through the night for. That he was worth the gas and the cold and the miles and the hours standing in a school parking lot in the October chill, saying simply and without qualification, "Not on our watch." That kind of decision doesn't leave a place entirely. It settles into the concrete and the air and the memory of everyone who was present and everyone who will hear the story afterward. And it waits there, quiet and permanent, available to anyone who needs to know that such decisions are possible, that people make them, that the world contains this alongside everything else it contains. And a boy in a leather vest stood in a garage in Knoxville and ate birthday cake with the people who had shown up for him, and outside the mountains held the last light of the day, and everything was ordinary, and everything had changed, and he was not afraid.